Somewhere in the Great Smoky Mountains, in a language spoken by fewer than 2,000 people today, there is a name that used to keep children close to the fire at night. Utlunta, Spearfinger. The Cherokee who spoke of her were specific about what she was, not a spirit, not a metaphor, a woman-shaped thing with skin like stone, immune to arrows, immune to knives, strong enough to crush a skull in one hand. And at the end of that hand, in place of a finger, a blade of solid rock, long as a knife, sharp enough to open a body in one motion. She could look like anyone, an old woman gathering herbs, someone's own grandmother walking the trail home. And when a traveler let their guard down near her, she used that finger and she took the liver and she moved on to the next trail before anyone knew to be afraid. For a while, nobody could stop her. Warriors couldn't cut her. Fire didn't touch her. She was, as far as anyone could tell, unkillable. This is not a story historians dismiss as decoration. It was recorded directly from Cherokee tradition bearers in the 1880s by a Smithsonian ethnologist who lived among the Eastern Band for years to get it right. And the same basic figure, stone-skinned, murderous, nearly unkillable, turns up independently in the oral traditions of nations who never spoke to each other, separated by 1,000 miles of unrelated language and geography. One story doesn't mean anything. A pattern might. Stay with us. We're going to tell you exactly how the Cherokee say she was finally stopped, and then we're going to show you why the same monster keeps showing up in places that have no reason to have heard of her. Almost everything we know about Ulunta in detail comes from one source, James Mooney, an ethnologist sent by the Smithsonian Institution to the Qualla Boundary in western North Carolina, starting in 1887. Mooney did something unusual for his era. He didn't pass through. He stayed, learned the language well enough to work directly with it, and built relationships with tradition bearers who trusted him enough to speak plainly, men and women who had learned these stories the way they were meant to be learned, from elders who had learned them the same way before that. The result, published in 1900 as Myths of the Cherokee, is still the primary written record for a huge portion of Cherokee oral tradition, not because Cherokee memory needed a white ethnologist to make it real, but because Mooney's fieldwork happened to land at a moment when a huge amount of that knowledge was still fully alive and still being actively passed down, and he had the sense to write it down close to verbatim instead of smoothing it into something more palatable for a Victorian readership. It's worth understanding what Mooney was actually working against, methodologically, because it's the reason this record is trusted the way it is. By the 1880s, more than half a century after removal, had already scattered the majority of the Cherokee Nation west along the Trail of Tears. The eastern band remaining in the Smokies represented one of the few places where a continuous, unbroken chain of oral transmission was still intact and still functioning the way it had for centuries. Mooney wasn't reconstructing something broken. He was documenting something that at that specific moment was still whole, which is part of why later scholars, including Cherokee scholars, have generally treated his transcriptions as unusually reliable rather than as a Victorian outsider's guesswork. He cross-checked versions against multiple tradition bearers. He noted where accounts diverged instead of silently picking the version he liked best. That's not the standard practice of most 19th century ethnography, and it's a large part of why Myths of the Cherokee is still cited as a primary source, not a curiosity, more than a century later. Utlunta is one of the darker entries in that record. Mooney didn't soften her. The killings are killings. The fear in the communities that told this story to their children was, by every account, genuine and specific, not the vague unease of a ghost story, but the practical fear of something that could actually kill you on a specific trail, and had, strip away the parts that sound like folklore polish and what's left is oddly specific. Ulunta's body was stone, or stone-like, over most of its surface, strong enough that the ordinary weapons of the time did nothing to her. Arrows glanced off. She was physically built like something the Cherokee, hunting and fighting toolkit simply hadn't been designed to stop. The one departure from an ordinary human body was the hand. Where a finger should have been, she carried something described as a blade or an awl of stone, long, rigid, and sharp enough to open a rib cage in a single strike. She used it to kill quickly, and specifically to take the liver, which several versions of the tradition treat as the actual point of the killing, not incidental to it, and she could pass. That's the detail that made her genuinely dangerous instead of merely monstrous. She could take on the appearance of someone the victim already trusted, a relative, an old woman known to the community, someone with every reason to be standing on that trail. The killing didn't come from a stranger, it came from someone who looked exactly like it shouldn't have been a threat at all until it was too late to matter. She was also in several tellings, associated specifically with stone and with the underground, able to move through solid rock the way a person moves through open air, appearing and vanishing from the mountainside itself. Not a creature living apart from the land, a creature that was in some functional sense made of it. There's a reason the liver detail keeps showing up across the tellings instead of getting smoothed away. In a lot of Cherokee medicine and belief, the liver carries real weight. It isn't a random organ a storyteller reached for because it sounded gruesome. Taking it wasn't incidental to the killing. In several versions, it's presented as the actual motive, the thing Utlunta was hunting for in the first place, which makes her less like an animal killing for food and more like something running its own private, comprehensible economy of harm, one with a purpose a listener could actually follow, even while finding it horrifying. And she didn't only threaten adults capable of defending themselves. Several tellings are specific that children were especially at risk, gathering wood, playing near the tree line, exactly the kind of everyday, unsupervised moment a predator that can look like anyone would be built to exploit. That detail does real work in the story. It's not there to shock. It's there to explain precisely why an entire community would organize a coordinated hunt for one target instead of just avoiding a bad stretch of trail. This wasn't a monster you could simply route around. Here's where the story stops being simple horror and becomes something closer to a puzzle the whole community had to solve together. Because the ordinary answer, fight harder, had already failed. The warriors organized. They tried direct confrontation and it didn't work. Her stone body turned aside every strike that should have ended a threat like this. What finally worked was information, not force. According to the tradition, it was the small birds, a titmouse, and in some tellings specifically the chickadee, who gave up the one detail that made her killable at all. Her heart, unlike the rest of her, wasn't protected by stone. It sat in her right hand in the palm. That single fact changed everything. A hunting party dug a pit trap along a trail she was known to travel, concealed it, and waited. When she came and reached toward them the way she always reached toward a victim, they had exactly the target the birds had given them and exactly one chance to use it. An arrow found the palm of that hand. And the thing that arrows had done nothing to for as long as anyone could remember went down and did not get back up. It's worth sitting with what that ending actually says underneath the monster story mechanics of it. The birds, the smallest, least dangerous things in the whole story, are the ones who solve what warriors with weapons could not. The killing blow only works because the community first listened to something it had no obvious reason to listen to. That's not a detail that reads like it was added for excitement. It reads like the actual point. Here's what should make you pay attention rather than shrug this off as one region's ghost story. The Cherokee didn't just tell one stone monster story. Mooney also recorded a second related figure, Nun Yunui, Stone Man, a similarly near invulnerable cannibal giant, defeated in his case not by an arrow, but by a very specific ritual intervention involving 7 claps of thunder. Two independently structured stone giant traditions from the same nation, both centering on something whose body simply does not respond to ordinary weapons, and travel far outside Cherokee territory into completely unrelated language families and completely unrelated geography, and the same shape keeps appearing. Haudenosaunee tradition in what's now upstate New York describes the Stonish giants, Janangswa, a race with skin like stone defeated only through a specific hard-won trick rather than brute force. Choctaw tradition, 1,300 miles to the southwest, in an entirely different language family, preserves stories of an early, physically formidable people the Choctaws' own ancestors had to contend with before the land was theirs. None of these nations were exchanging these stories with each other. There was no shared media, no common written record, no reason for a story shape to travel between them by ordinary means. And yet the core structure, a nearly unkillable stone-associated, physically outsized threat, finally stopped only through a specific piece of hard-won knowledge rather than raw force, shows up again and again, independently, across a huge stretch of the continent. Folklorists have a real, ongoing argument about what that means. One camp treats it as a predictable outcome of how human storytelling works in general. Cultures that face any large, dangerous, hard-to-kill threat, real or exaggerated, tend to converge on invulnerable except for one hidden weakness as a narrative solution, because it's a satisfying story shape independent of what actually happened. Another camp points out that convergent invention, this precise, this repeatedly, is itself worth explaining rather than assuming, and that dismissing every version at once forecloses a question that hasn't actually been answered, just declared uninteresting. Nobody has settled that argument. We're not going to pretend we can settle it here either. It's worth being precise about what does and doesn't belong in this comparison, because it would be easy to blur every scary being from the old stories into one undifferentiated pile, and that would actually be a worse, lazier version of this video. The Wendigo from Algonquian-speaking nations to the north is not this pattern. It's a story about starvation and the specific horror of a person transformed by consuming another person, built around a completely different fear and a completely different narrative logic. Lumping it in with the stone giants because both are scary Native American monsters would be exactly the kind of flattening this channel exists to push back against. The pattern worth noticing is narrower and stranger than scary legendary creature. It's specifically skin or body that ordinary weapons cannot penetrate, paired with exactly one concealed point of vulnerability, paired with a resolution that depends on someone acquiring hidden knowledge rather than simply fighting harder. That specific three-part shape is what shows up independently in nations that had no contact with each other. Here's a detail that makes the pattern even harder to wave away. It isn't only showing up between different nations, separated by 1,000 miles. It shows up twice within Cherokee tradition alone, in two stories that don't appear to be the same story told differently. Udlunta and Nunyunui have different origins, different methods, different victims, and different endings, and yet both land on the identical underlying shape. A body immune to conventional weapons, one specific hidden exception to that immunity. A community that survives only by first acquiring information it didn't start with. If a single culture can independently produce that same narrative architecture twice, using two unrelated characters, that's a real data point for the side of this argument that says the shape is just what a human storytelling tradition tends to produce when it needs to process an implacable danger, not proof by itself, but a real point. And it doesn't make the stories any less specific or any less clearly the Cherokee's own. Both were carried by Cherokee tradition bearers in Cherokee language, describing Cherokee land, long before Mooney ever arrived to write either of them down. Butlunta hasn't been retired to a folklore footnote. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians, based today at the Qualla boundary in the same mountains this story comes from, maintains active tradition keeping, specifically because stories like this one carry more than entertainment. They carry a working relationship between a community and the landscape it has occupied for longer than written record exists for the region at all. When a story ties a specific danger to a specific kind of terrain, to caves, to the stone bones of a mountain range, that's not incidental set dressing. It's a community's accumulated read on its own environment, encoded in a form that a child could actually remember and repeat. That's also probably the most honest answer to why this story is still told at all, and still worth hearing from outside the community that kept it. Not because anyone today expects to meet a stone-skinned woman on a mountain trail, but because a tradition specific enough, consistent enough, and independently echoed by nations who never spoke to each other is not just entertainment. It's a record of something. Even if what it's a record of is simply how people everywhere make sense of the parts of the world that could kill them and mostly can't be explained. There's also a quieter reason this story has outlasted a lot of others, and it has nothing to do with how frightening it is. It's a story where the people with the least power in the narrative, small birds, easy to overlook, easy to talk over, turn out to be the ones who actually save everyone. And the community survives specifically because it was willing to listen to them instead of dismissing them. That's not a moral tacked onto a monster story after the fact. In a tradition where oral transmission depends entirely on elders passing knowledge to people younger, and in a practical sense less powerful than themselves, a story that explicitly rewards listening to the smallest voice in the room is doing exactly the kind of cultural work that keeps a story worth retelling for well over a century. So, a monster invented to give shape to an old fear of the wilderness, or a folk memory distorted just enough by generations of retelling that we can no longer tell what it was actually describing in the first place. The Cherokee record is specific enough that Mooney trusted it enough to write it down almost exactly as he heard it, more than a century ago. The pattern across other nations is real enough that folklorists still argue about what it means, rather than agreeing to ignore it. And the story itself, notably, doesn't end with the monster explained. It ends with the monster dead, and the reason it could finally be killed left sitting there for the next generation to notice. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that was right. Was she ever real? Or was she always this? A shape the mountains gave to something the people who lived in them needed a way to survive. That was an open question in 1887, when Mooney first wrote it down. It still is.